Welcome to the FDN Thrive podcast. We interview leaders in the functional health space who bring you the most up-to-date, cutting-edge information for people who have tried it all for their health issues. We hope you enjoy the show.
And, I was like 30 years old. Well, no, I was 35 years old. And he was basically telling me my life was over. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know where the answers were. But when I left that office, I knew that traditional medicine had nothing to offer me.
All right, folks. Hello. Welcome back to another episode of the FDN Thrive podcast. I will be your host today. My name is Evan Transu, aka Health Coach Ev, and we will be interviewing none other than Whitney Morgan. Now, this woman is super sharp, super knowledgeable. She's helped me with many of my cases with different people I've worked with, and actually even myself. So I'm so glad that I got to talk to her today. Whitney Morgan is a licensed acupuncturist, functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner, and the founder of Whitney Morgan Nutrition. She also serves as a clinical advisor for FDN, where she assists other practitioners, such as myself, with their client cases. Now, you're going to hear in the interview that she actually had some very close family members following more of a traditional medicine route, but for her specific issues, she eventually learned that the only way she was going to get to the bottom of these things was by combining the best of both worlds, which we are huge advocates for. Let's not waste any more time. Here's the interview. Whitney, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, I'm super happy to join you, Evan. My pleasure.
You are one of our first FDNs on the FDN Thrive podcast. We had just done Ryan Monahan last, and it's cool to have some advisors on because I think FDNs in general are a wealth of knowledge, but then to have people that are actually clinically advising those FDNs, it's just really interesting to hear your stories and then how you actually learned enough to be able to do the work that you're doing. But we'll get into that second part there a little later. I want to start off just by asking about you. I mean, what was Whitney like as a kid? Because I know I have a little background of you that you dealt with some health issues that were, kind of severe overall in your life, but I don't really know when they started. So what was life like as a kid? Were you dealing with health issues then or pretty normal stuff?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a pretty hyper medical family. So every little symptom was kind of a health issue, right? There was a pill for everything. But I had allergies as a kid. I had some asthma, got a lot of ear infections, a lot of colds. I don't think I had any sort of serious health issues, but like I said, my family was pretty hyper medical. So I went to my pediatrician a lot more than my friends did. Right. So I probably paid a lot more attention to adverse symptoms than the normal kid did. So maybe a little bit of a hypochondriac because of the way I grew up. But looking back on it, I would say most of my stuff was environmental allergy related.
Got it. And when we're talking about the medical system, of course, you mean since there's a pill for everything, I guess it was more of a traditional background. What were like mom and dad doctors or?
Yeah. My
Okay.
dad's a surgeon. My mom was an OR nurse, and
Oh, wow.
my family was pretty much a lot of doctors throughout the generations, kind of a thing. So, yeah, medicine was the answer to everything.
Got it. So, all right, we will kind of progress then because for so many people out there, especially, the more average person that's not in this space, those types of symptoms, they sound completely normal.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're not usually the most debilitating thing in the world, but we know that just because they're common doesn't necessarily mean they're normal. And typically, they could actually even be maybe a warning sign of something deeper going on. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that you have a story with celiacs, and I genuinely don't know that. Is that correct that that's a condition that you deal with?
Yes. I was diagnosed with celiac disease in 2010. I'm a silent celiac, so I do not get GI distress from gluten consumption or gluten contamination. Never did. So they found it as a fluke. I had other autoimmune diagnoses before they ever found my celiac disease. So
Okay. Yeah. And that's definitely what I'd like to get into because one, you just hit on a really interesting point. I've never heard it referred to as silent celiac, but that makes so much sense because I think this is one of the issues that people have with
mhm,
getting diagnosed for a while. I had a friend, she has celiacs and she shows up with neurological symptoms, severe
yes,
anxiety, severe
yes,
depression, doesn't really have any stomach problems, but
exactly.
no one could ever figure out what was going on. So
Yeah.
obviously, if it's silent, that means I'm guessing, yeah, like you said, you figured it out after you had these other things. Let's talk about, all right, as a kid, you were overall, let's call it normal enough, right? Or common enough that no one was really looking into your health too deep. But then at some point you get these diagnoses of autoimmune disease. I mean, what's going on between the kid and that?
Yeah, well, interesting. Let me back up a little bit because there was this very uh, interesting occurrence when I think I was probably like 8 or 9 years old. My father was very concerned that I was always the smallest kid in the class. I just wasn't growing the way that my sisters had. So I was the little thing. And because he's an orthopedic surgeon, I remember him taking me to his office, and I spent a whole day getting like my entire body x-rayed. He x-rayed every single bone in my body,
Right.
trying to figure out what the hell is wrong with your bones, right? Well, now knowing what I know about celiac disease, obviously that was the way that I presented as failure to thrive, right? I was pretty much healthy and normal in every other way, except I was always the smallest kid in the class. And that's kind of one of the red flags for celiac disease in little kids. But it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I believe I started showing signs of celiac disease. And my first symptom was panic attacks. So, and that's what I see in my practice too, is a lot of people with gluten sensitivity and celiac disease, their primary presentation is neurological, not gut related.
So you think that happens, like that's something you're saying that is the majority of the time they're actually coming in more often with the neurological things than the other stuff.
I think that that's what makes it silent, right?
Yeah.
That when we say silent celiac, what we're really saying is celiac without a GI presentation. But neurological presentations are so common that really, if you've got someone that has chronic panic attacks and depression, my first question would be, well, what's their gluten sensitivity status, right? Because that's such a common correlation that I see.
That that is super interesting that you mentioned that because I was someone who eventually found out much later, years later, that I did have a gluten sensitivity, and I was sitting around at literally 5 years old, about five and a half, dealing with panic attacks already without any history of trauma. Grew up in a great family. It didn't add up or make sense. And you know what? I want to be fair to the audience here because I know we have a variety of people listening. Some people actually might not understand. I feel like this is something that's commonly confused. So I'll digress for a second and talk about, can you explain the differences between like celiacs and a gluten sensitivity and maybe even versus a gluten allergy so people can know the difference?
Sure. Well, if you have celiac disease, you have a gluten sensitivity, right? But you can have a gluten sensitivity and not have celiac disease. So, celiac disease is an autoimmune disease that occurs in the small intestine, and it occurs because of your reaction to gluten. So, gluten sensitivity can bring on many different autoimmune diseases, right? It's just that celiac disease is one kind of small slice of the pie. So the way I think about it is really wheat sensitivity is the big umbrella. And underneath that umbrella, then you have your gluten sensitivity and you have your, gluten allergy and you have your celiac disease, but they're all kind of part and parcel of this big umbrella of wheat sensitivity, if that makes sense.
Sure, got it. And I think that's really useful just for people out there because I sometimes forget, when we get in this space, we're in a bubble and not everyone understands all these differences, or, some people think gluten sensitivity by itself, not, celiacs type of thing, isn't even real. I'm like, well, I'll tell you this, it's absolutely real. There's science backing it up. And I will just tell you from personal experience, having removed that after finding out I was sensitive, that was very powerful. So anyway, going back to the symptoms that you're dealing with, you're having these maybe more like, I mean, anxiety type symptoms. And what was going on that led to the autoimmune disease? I mean, was that already happening, or was it just that was the first warning sign?
No, the first warning sign were the panic attacks, and that
Hmm.
was in my 20s. And then a year after my daughter was born, I was 31 years old, I developed psoriasis. So that was my first autoimmune diagnosis. Then, several years after that, I developed interstitial cystitis, which is an autoimmune disease of the bladder, and then Hashimoto's. Then in 2010, I was finally diagnosed with celiac disease, but only because I went to a GI doctor because I was in acupuncture school and I started getting these stomach pains, kind of sharp stabbing, intermittent stomach pains. I thought I had an ulcer because I was studying all the time and I was under a lot of stress. So he did an endoscopy. And when I woke up from the endoscopy, he was beside my the little thing they have you on, the little
Yeah.
bed, and he said, "I can't believe it, but you have celiac disease." He was 99% sure that I did. He wasn't expecting to find it. He wasn't looking for it, but he found it. I had absolutely no villi. Basically, it looked like like a slick ice slide in my small intestine. There was just nothing there. So, so yeah, I was very lucky that they found it, because who knows what other autoimmune issues I would have started collecting over the years if they never had found my celiac disease.
Well, and yeah, and this is, I mean, that's intense stuff to get multiple diagnoses
Yeah,
of different autoimmune conditions. I mean, I got to ask because this is always just fascinating to me. What's going on through your head as you continue to get these things? Like, was there a skepticism in terms of wondering, like, why do I feel like this? Like, I shouldn't feel like this as a
yeah.
human, because I've actually felt like a lot of us in this space do get to that point where even when I was a teenager, I'm just like, what, I was in my science class and we're talking about everyone having the best genes, and evolution, all this stuff. And whatever your opinion is of that out there is irrelevant to me. I'm being told I have the best genes. Well, why do I feel like crap? That didn't make sense that I have the best genes and half my class is overweight. I got severe acne. It didn't add up. So, what was your perspective as you keep getting these diagnoses?
Yeah, well, when I got my first one, the psoriasis, I was still very much in that medical mind frame, right? It was just a skin issue. It was a dermatological issue. Put the steroid cream on and try and just deal with it. That was before I got off that traditional medical path and started looking into alternative medicine. It wasn't until I got my interstitial cystitis diagnosis that that was my breakup with traditional medicine,
Okay.
because I was sitting in my doctor's office. He was the head of urology at the university where I was living, and he was giving me my diagnosis, and he said to me, it's not going to kill you, but you are going to die with it. Nothing can be done. Your pain's probably going to get worse. We can try and manage it, but you should probably join a support group. And you
Wow.
know, I mean, I was like 30 years old. Well, no, I was 35 years old, and um, he was basically telling me my life was over. And for those people who are listening, they don't know, interstitial cystitis is like having the worst bladder infection of your life, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and nothing takes the pain away. Right? It's really all consuming. So in that moment, I just said, no, I'm sorry, I don't accept this. And pretty much every cell in my body said it for me. It wasn't like me thinking it, it was my
Right.
body
Right.
thinking it. It was like, no, this huge visceral response. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know where the answers were. But when I left that office, I knew that traditional medicine had nothing to offer me. So that's when I started, looking into naturopathy and nutrition and acupuncture. I started getting acupuncture treatments and doing some Chinese medicine stuff. Then I went to acupuncture school, right? So that started this journey. And when I graduated from acupuncture school, that's when I found FDN. And to me, FDN was Chinese medicine for the 21st century in Western language. Because
Yeah.
it's really the same fundamental philosophy. It's what Chinese medicine calls the root branch philosophy, where the symptoms show up in the branches, but the real imbalance is in the root, right? And so that's that whole gardening kind of metaphor, right? So the gardener tends to the soil in order to heal the tree or the plants. And that's what FDN, the minute I saw it was Reed's presentation with oh, I forget his name, guy who used to be really big, had a
Sean
pod.
Croxton, maybe?
Yes,
Gotcha.
exactly. Yeah, Croxton presentation where he was doing the whole thyroid thing, with the liver and the gut and the thyroid, and it just blew my mind. And I was like, oh my God, that is exactly what Chinese medicine is all about too, how all of these things fit together. You can't like split the body up into parts, right? It's all this kind of symphony, and all these different instruments, but they all got to work together. So after I saw that presentation, I was like, okay, I'm in. And I joined FDN, went through the program, and I mean, my life has been transformed. For starters, I don't have interstitial cystitis anymore. It's not in my body. I don't have it.
Right.
I don't have any Hashimoto symptoms, right? I don't. I don't really have any autoimmune symptoms anymore. I occasionally will get a little psoriasis patch on my knee or my elbow when I'm under a lot of stress or I'm not eating the way I should. Um, but for all intents and purposes, I have a completely different body than I did, 10 years ago, right? So it really has been an amazing journey, and it's kind of cool to get to a place in your life where you're actually grateful for the diagnoses that you received. I'm so glad that I got all of those autoimmune diseases, and I'm glad that I had that experience with that one urologist that was so devastating. And I'm really glad for my celiac diagnosis, because all of those things have brought me here, and I'm talking to you, right?
Right.
And all that stuff is part of my past, right? And what's really cool is that I think in this traditional medicine space, we've become so programmed to believe that diagnosis is destiny, and it's just not, and we really do just have to get down to the fundamentals and think about what are the root causes, what are those underlying imbalances, and if we can fix those, the body knows how to heal, right? So yeah, pretty amazing journey.
That, I love what you just said about the diagnosis isn't destiny. Of all the little lines that we have, test, don't guess, whatever. I
Yeah,
haven't heard that one yet, and I will be using that. So thank you.
sure.
But that was, it's just, I don't know how to describe what it is, but I've heard it almost universally now because we're talking about some pretty scientific stuff. Obviously, FDN is very science based.
Yeah,
However, there seems to be this moment with the practitioners or people that come as clients that they're fed up. They have this line that gets drawn where we just say, because even Ryan Monahan described the same thing. It's like, I know this doesn't make sense. Like, this just doesn't add up. And then that led you
right.
to this whole trajectory, a complete different trajectory, which had to be even tougher for you because you come from this Western medicine background. And as everyone knows, I mean, I'll probably state it on every podcast just so it's clear for people. FDN and everyone that represents it certainly is not against Western medicine. We have
No,
MDs that have graduated the program. Like this is using the best of both worlds type of thing. You said something key. You said, Western medicine doesn't have anything to offer you. Not that it
right,
doesn't have anything to offer. There's a large
right.
difference there. So you got into FDN. And what I want to talk about next is kind of the different things that maybe work to get you to where you're at today. Because for some people listening to hear a story of I don't really deal with symptoms of Hashimoto's. I don't deal with something that was causing my bladder and body pain 24/7. That's almost incomprehensible. A lot
Yeah.
of people don't get that. So I know for you, one thing probably was removing gluten. I'm going to guess that was a pretty big thing. But that has a lot of nuances with it. So
Yeah.
the reason I'm going there is because how would you describe, and maybe we have to get specific, I'm not sure, but there's a difference between gluten-free, like, maybe the average like 40-year-old woman has tried because they're really trying to do their best, but they don't have all the information, versus gluten-free Whitney Morgan style. So like, what does someone need to do if they're celiac to truly get this out of their life?
Well, I believe that in order to be 100% gluten-free, you have to live in a gluten-free house. And I didn't always believe that. There was a time in my celiac journey where I tried to create this gluten-free bubble around myself, and meanwhile, everyone else in my family was still eating the way they wanted to eat. Because God forbid I inconvenience anybody, right? But eventually I reached this point where it was just clear to me that I wasn't getting the results I knew I should be getting, that it wasn't adding up, just like what Ryan was saying. It didn't make sense that I was doing all the quote unquote right things that I knew should be making a profound difference in my life. And I wasn't getting where I needed to be. And after I started doing the testing, it became clear that I was still getting contaminated. I was just getting microdose contaminated, right? Periodically in my own home. And that was creating a huge obstacle for me. So things really transformed for me when I finally drew that boundary and said, that's it. It's me or the gluten guys pick, right? Because I'll move out if I have to,
Yes, understood.
but this is my boundary. And once I did that and everyone went gluten free, then the pieces started falling into place. So, and I've seen that also in my practice with other gluten sensitive folks, where, we run the labs, they're still getting exposed. And it becomes that final domino that really has to fall. And I think it's very difficult because it's a mindset thing. It's a self-worth piece. I hate to say it, but predominantly I work with women, and most women that I work with have a hard time putting themselves first, before their family, or putting themselves first to the point where they're asking other people to change their behaviors, right? In order for them to fix their health. So I think that's the real mindset obstacle that most people need to kind of get through. But once they do, if you can truly have a gluten-free house, then then you're in a place where you can transform everything else.
Wow. And I mean, that's something because I've heard that before. And it honestly may have been from you in one of the FDN groups. But the thing, it challenges me because I've lived in households for the last few years. I use separate pans, and I mean, I keep my stuff away from theirs. So I'm curious though, and I feel like this could be useful for people out there. Do you think it is like just impossible for me, even if I am using separate pans, to actually be truly gluten free? I mean, I have my own food that gets cooked by me personally. Am I just kind of, is that just wishful thinking? Or is it actually possible? And maybe in your circumstance, it just wasn't realistic because you had multiple other family members that maybe didn't understand this stuff or respect it as much at that time.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying it's improbable.
Okay.
Um, but if you are if you are living in a house where other people are still consuming gluten, but you're basically quarantining yourself, right, in your own home, and creating this separate space for yourself in the kitchen and whatnot. And if you are symptom free, if your health is vibrant and you don't have any complaints, then more power to you. I would still say though, you want to confirm, right? You want to at least run a wheat zoomer or some comparable lab like the Cyrex Array 3 at least once a year to confirm that your antibodies are normal, right? I would actually do it twice a year if you're living in a space where other people are consuming gluten. Um, and if you're able to successfully do that, great. But the people that are coming to see me or other FDN practitioners, they're not coming to us because they feel awesome, usually, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
They
Yes, you're
have
right.
issues. And most of the people that I work with that are gluten sensitive, and they know they're gluten sensitive, but they still live in a house where other people are eating gluten, they're coming to me because they have chronic health issues that they're still struggling with in spite of their gluten-free diet. And 9 times out of 10, they're still getting exposed when we run the labs. So at
Got
some
it.
point you have to just kind of get real with yourself, and
I
say,
love it.
well, what's the risk benefit here, you know?
Well, I think that just sold me on, running my first Zoomer on myself just to go
Yeah.
check that out. So I appreciate that very much. Obviously, for anyone with celiacs, or let's be honest, a lot of health issues out there, I think the removal of gluten is going to be a pretty big thing for them. But of course, we learn a lot more about just that with FDN, and everyone's things that they need to work on based on what they learned in FDN could look a little different. So I'm very curious, like, what did you experience through the FDN training and maybe labs that you ran that you found like big healing opportunities for yourself that were kind of unrelated, or I guess it's all related, but
Yeah.
it was a different step than removing gluten.
Yeah. Um, well, I went through FDN a few years after my celiac diagnosis. And when I got diagnosed, of course, the answer was, well, just go gluten free. That's the answer. That's the treatment, right? But what I learned through the FDN work is really how much dysfunction or disharmony or imbalance um, there was present in my body across several systems, most likely due to a progressive, unidentified, and unmanaged autoimmune disease that had been burning through my body, right, for decades. Um, that leaves kind of its own, wake of dysfunction, right, behind it. And so FDN really allowed me to go above and beyond just simply, well, get rid of the gluten and start tending to the damage that had been done by years of autoimmune progression, years of nutrient deficiencies, right, brought on by the celiac disease, um, dysfunctions in hormones because of that as well. There's just so much damage that's done due to one or two triggers, right? And mine was gluten, obviously. But that was the big aha for me, is that it's just not enough to go gluten free. It's not that simple, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that has to be repaired afterwards. And the way I started thinking about it, and the way I talk to clients about it, is, if your house is burning down, you have to put out the fire, right? That's the obvious thing you have to do. But once you do it, there's a lot of damage. Now you have to assess the damage. You have to go in, you have to repair it to restore things back to their functional status, right? So putting out the fire is not the work. The work comes after. And that's kind of how I see going gluten free. That's just putting out the fire. Now you got to do the work of repairing all of the damage. And that's what FDN allowed me to do, to identify it, assess it, and create healing strategies to correct it, right? So that's really the beauty, and that's why it's so much like Chinese medicine. It operates in the same way.
Right. And so, for those out there that don't know, because this study is still one that I show people all the time because it astonishes me. Only 7% of people with celiac disease, after they get their diagnoses, 16 months later, actually have healed gut lining. So that means
Right,
93% of
right.
people that get diagnosed with celiacs, even though, if I'm not mistaken, the cells in the gut lining are some of the fastest regenerating in the body. They
Sure.
should be able to heal well. But 16 months later, a year and change, 93% of people still have
That's
that
right.
damage. And that just shows it's wonderful that conventional medicine has come up with these tests to figure out these things, or the fact that we can do an endoscopy on someone and take this and be like, oh wow, yeah, no, this is damaged microvilli. But where we need to combine the functional side of things or natural side of things is actually maintaining the lifestyle for those people and
Right.
making sure they're actually getting better. Because yeah, the doc just saying go gluten free, unfortunately, is a pretty incomplete thing. Now, I love the way that you described FDN because that's how I felt. And I think most of us feel that. I think a lot of the people that come to FDN Thrive as clients, even, it's people that are saying, I have done stuff before. I've changed my diet. Like, I'm actually living, quote unquote, healthier than a lot of the people in my life. Why don't I have better results? And it really comes down to, I love your analogy about the house. Yeah, you could remove or you could put out the fire, but you still got to assess stuff afterwards. And that's what I was missing. That's where the lab test came in. What was like maybe something for you more specifically that was, to continue your analogy, like an assessment of the house? Like, did you find something on a stool test that was major, or maybe another food sensitivity that you didn't know about? I'd love to hear like one example of something you found specifically in your labs.
Sure. I found a few things. In the stool test, I found that I had absolutely no immune function in my gut. Big surprise, right? No secretory IgA to speak of, and as consequence of that, I had a lot of infections. Right, I had a couple of parasites, Giardia being one of them, and a lot of bacterial overgrowth, a lot of yeast, and also found out that I had heavy metals, which is probably one of the reasons why I had such a profound yeast issue, because I had some metal toxicity as well. And then the other thing I found out was that it wasn't just gluten. And this happens to so many people who are gluten sensitive, that you develop these cross reactivities to other non gluten foods. So your immune system still thinks you're eating gluten, even though you're not. So I had sensitivity to cow dairy, to corn. to rice, and all of those things cross-react with gluten, right? So most people, when they go gluten-free, what do they start consuming more of, right? Rice,
Right.
um, corn, right? All of these things that are quote unquote safe. Well, they're not really safe for people who have gluten sensitivity. You do have to run the cross-reactive tests to make sure that those non-gluten foods are safe for you. The majority of the time, anyone who's gluten sensitive has at least one cross-reactivity, right? And then, the other thing is just all of the damage that's done to the gut because of the celiac disease or the gluten sensitivity. Well, if all you do is take away that one trigger, but you're still consuming other foods that are damaging to the gut lining, right? For me, the big healing piece from a dietary standpoint was shifting to more of an ancestral diet where I was eliminating all of the grains and the legumes. That's when my gut really healed.
That's awesome. So, and for those that don't know, like Whitney, again, I had mentioned this in the beginning. She's a clinical advisor for FDN, but it's someone that I go to even when I have people that maybe I've worked with, and I'm like, hey, can you check out this lab? And she helps me out, and I'm always like getting inspired to do different things, or I learn different things, and like after this interview already, I'm just like, whoa, I should probably at least check the Cyrex, the cross reactivity thing. Like that wouldn't hurt, or the wheat zoomer. So it's just fun. So thank you for sharing that with us. One of the, I guess, more final topics we'll get to today is maybe some client success stories, because it's one thing to have the practitioners come on here and share, wow, like awesome stories,
Mhm.
major transformations in your life, but it's cool to show that this is replicatable with the I think duplicatable would be a better word. I'm not sure replicatable is a word, but it's duplicatable with the FTN system and principles. So, do you have maybe like a client story in mind where they came to you, they have no idea what's going on, and you work with them, and their whole life is just kind of changed around, like, or just one of your favorite people to work with, maybe?
Sure. Well, one comes to mind, and probably because we've been talking so much about gluten sensitivity. Um, One young woman in her 20s, um, who had had a very brief, actually, like a brief presentation of psoriasis on the elbows, and then it disappeared. Um, had a lot of what we would just call, basic histamine inflammation, right? So a lot intermittent, like histamine reactions to different foods for like no apparent reason. Developed multiple food sensitivities that foods she used to be able to eat and no longer was able to eat. And then going through her intake forms, discovered that she also had this experience of sleep paralysis and what she described as kind of lucid nightmares, where she would kind of hallucinate these very, very intense nightmares and then not be able to wake up from them, and her body would be kind of paralyzed, and she'd feel like she was awake and she was still hallucinating, and it was very difficult for her to figure out what was real and what was the dream, and this was very terrifying, right?
Yeah, yeah, that sounds scary.
Yeah, very, very scary. And then she, around these nightmares, she would, after she would wake up, she would have um auditory hallucinations from the nightmares. Like she was continuing to hallucinate, but it wasn't visual anymore. She was firmly awake, but she was hearing things that weren't there. So this is very scary. But this was not what she came to me for, right? But this is what came up in her intake forms. Anyway, we ran a series of labs, and of course, I ran. At that time, we didn't have the Zoomers. I ran some Cyrex labs on her, and a gut test found she had definitely a lot of bacterial overgrowth, some histamine producing bacteria, which made a lot of sense given her symptoms. She had a very, very leaky gut. So, of course, that's makes the food sensitivity, her acquiring additional food sensitivities, that made sense. But we found she had a severe reaction to gluten. Now, she was kind of like me. She could eat gluten and not have a problem, right? Not have any sort of GI issues. But once she eliminated the gluten and the dairy, because she had a dairy sensitivity too. She had that cross reactivity. Once she eliminated the gluten and the dairy and we cleaned up her gut, all of that nighttime nightmare hallucination stuff disappeared. Okay. So
Yeah.
what's really cool is if you look at the research around dairy and gluten and different peptides of both of those food proteins, there are specific peptides that have neurological impact and put people at greater risk for mood disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, things like that. And then you remove those foods and suddenly all of that stuff resolves. I mean, that happens in the literature, but to experience it with a client, she was in her early 20s, and for schizophrenia, usually that the 20s is when it kind of comes on, right? So at least that's pretty common. And that was something that when I was looking through her intake form that I was, kind of that was a red flag for me. It's like, that kind of hallucinatory experience and hearing voices and hearing things that aren't there, that is kind of a warning sign. And then to see that she had a sensitivity to peptides that were directly related to schizophrenia, it's like, oh my God, right? And then to see the success afterwards, that she removes those things from her life and those experiences go away. I mean, that to me, I can't say for sure. I'm not a medical provider. I can't diagnose anybody, but in my hopeful brain, I'm going, wow, did she just avoid maybe a lifelong dependence upon some sort of, psychiatric drug down the road? Did
Yeah.
she avoid a diagnosis because she got rid of the gluten and the dairy, and cleaned up the gut, right? So that was a pretty cool experience.
I'd say so. Yeah, that was, I try to keep my microphone on mute just when the person's talking, but I'm like over here, like, yes, like this is awesome because that is so something that you wouldn't even think is normally connected. And you beat me to it because you read in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm like, is there any, I'm not saying that this couldn't happen because of removal of gluten and dairy. I have seen things that you would think are totally unconnected, but to know that there's actually literature showing this relationship with the peptides, I had no idea about
Yep.
that. So you and I will definitely have to connect after this because I would love to read something like that and just be able to share that with people because I'm in the mental health space as well, and to know that this could be something that, I mean, I knew it was having some effect, but that's a pretty direct one, right? That is, and like you said, to think that who knows what just happened with her life. I mean, that's certainly what happened to you and I, because I had autoimmune disease diagnosis at 18 years old. I was told you're going to be on a medication for the rest of your life
Yeah.
and you're going to progressively lose hearing. It was Meniere's disease. And I didn't accept that. I did not accept that. Kind of like you said, every cell in your body, wasn't going to do that.
Yep.
And I look at what happened to me. Now, yes, it was more than just removing gluten, certainly, but that is a literal shift in the course of my life and the course of your life, and of course, the course of this woman's life. It's just really, it's like a butterfly effect amplified because you just wonder how much different is their overall experience going to be and their impact on this world because they don't have these things. Because we all know, in this space, when you're dealing with chronic disease, it's kind of hard sometimes even to do something as basic as just be a nice person, right? You're moody, let
Yeah.
alone like worrying about career and an impact on this world. That's just not something that's at the forefront of your mind when you're battling your own body every single day. So that was an amazing story. One other question that I forgot to ask before that story that I was interested in is, it clearly took a while for you to actually get sick, and now you're at this wonderful point. I mean, you diagnosed in 2010. It's 2020 at the time of this recording, and you are, I mean, virtually symptom free of these autoimmune diseases. Like you said, little stress here and there causes some psoriasis breakouts, which just shows it. This is a lifelong thing, right? Like we need
Right.
to maintain ourselves lifelong. We can't just, oh, we did FDN stuff for 3 months and now we're healed. That's not how it works, right? We were doing the wrong thing forever, so we need to modify and course correct for the rest of our lives. I am curious though, how long would you say it took to actually get to the point where, oh yeah, I don't really deal with these symptoms of autoimmunity anymore? Like, how long have you been like this?
Uh, I would say it's been since 2000 and probably 14, because that's when I finally said, to my family, it's me or the gluten.
Got
and
it.
and that created that final shift that I needed. Because from 2010 to 2014, I was doing um, a lot of significant change, a lot of, naturopathy and herbs and Chinese medicine. And then in 2013, doing all the FDN work on myself and all of that. But until I put myself first and created that boundary around myself, that's what it took for me. That's what it took for my body to finally get everything it needed in order to, let all of those other symptoms go, basically, right?
Right.
So my personal feeling is that I am probably one of those people that has a very, very low threshold for gluten exposure. I believe that the dose makes the poison. And you might be able to tolerate 25, 30 parts per million. Maybe for me, it's 4 parts per million really pisses off my immune system, right? So I believe that I'm super hypersensitive, and even micro exposures were enough to keep me inflamed to the point where I was still symptomatic.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, yeah, that's, quite a bit of time, but obviously for people out there, you were clearly getting better overall throughout that
Yes.
time, or at least made those initial things. Because how I always look at this is there's a subsection of people where, I mean, listen, they'll do the most basic stuff in the world, maybe remove a food, maybe change one lifestyle habit, and they're, damn near perfect in a month just because they didn't have that much major stuff going on, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, so jealous.
They
But
are so annoying, aren't they?
yeah. Yeah, they're like, oh, this is great. Thanks for telling me to remove gluten. Like, they're totally good. They can go out, drink, do whatever they want to do for the
Yeah.
most part. But then there is a category that I think we're really speaking to, and we're certainly a part of, where we've had these extra things. And, we got to be a little careful if we're going to really try to get better and do these things that seem almost miraculous, like healing the body. What is a general rule of thumb, do you think, for people that maybe work with you? Like, how, because I know it could take almost technically, I mean, months and months, if not years, to get like a full remission or, hey, we're fully back to normal. But I feel like a lot of people can feel 50 to 60% better in a matter of a month or two a lot of the times. Like, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
absolutely agree with that. And I think, quite honestly, the reason why my healing journey spans a decade is because I was doing a lot of hit and miss stuff. I was jumping down a lot of rabbit holes. I was making a lot of different changes, but I didn't really see with clarity the whole board. You know what I mean? I did not see the whole terrain. It wasn't until I got to where I was, like in 2015 or so, that I could reverse engineer everything, look back and go, oh yeah, that now I see how all of those things fit together. And I think that's why it's so beneficial for people out there who are struggling with their health to work with people like you and me, to find an FDN practitioner, because not only do we have our own health journey and our own experience, and we have that ability to empathize with what they're going through, but we can accelerate their healing because ours took so damn long. Right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like we can now, kind of build a bigger, better um, strategy, and pathway. We kind of cleared it for everybody else. That's how I look at it, and that's what keeps me grateful for all of my journey, as painful as it was and as long as it was. If I knew everything that I know now in 1996, when I got my psoriasis, I could have avoided so much, right?
Mhm.
But you and I wouldn't be having this conversation. And
Yeah.
right. So
I couldn't have said that better, because it's first of all, not only the way I want to look at it, but it's like there is no other way to look at it, because you're just
right,
going to make yourself miserable. I could sit here and regret having so many issues in school, to mental health issues or whatever. But guess what?
right.
This created two really passionate people who really care about
Absolutely.
others. And like you said, because we went through this, now, yeah, someone talks to me, I'm like, I can figure stuff out a lot quicker. And
Yeah.
feeling 50% better in the first month or two, yes, is that the quick fix pill society mindset? No, it's not. We want that in a day. When you're chronically sick and you start feeling 50% better in 30 days, trust me, the people out there that we're talking to, they know how much or how valuable that is, right? I would have done anything just to feel 15% better, let alone cool, we'll get that big win in the first month or 2 months, and then I think it's a little slower after that, but it keeps working, and it's fantastic. So I
Yeah.
just appreciate so much your time here today. I'm creating a trend. I'm working on this, but I feel like a lot of us say similar things, so we'll see how this works out long term. But I'm trying to create this signature final question, and then I'm going to create a
Uh-oh.
compilation of these eventually. So it's simple stuff, but I want to know, as with the knowledge that you have at this current time, if there was one thing, a health habit, that you could get people to do just universally, and I understand, listen, my disclaimer on that is I know not everyone's the same, but you have a magic wand, you can get the world to change one thing. What would Whitney Morgan get the entire world to start doing or not doing tomorrow?
Well, I think you probably know the answer to that. If I had the genie blink and I could just have one wish, I would eradicate wheat from the face of the earth.
Whitney, I know a lot of people out there are not going to like us, but I got to be honest. I support your wish in eradicating wheat from this earth. I think we would all be a lot better off. And the easiest way to remove these things is to simply remove temptation. And what better way to remove temptation than remove it completely from the face of the earth? So I can definitely get behind that. Folks, for anyone out there interested in working with Whitney, you can go to morgannutrition.com. That's MORGAN nutrition.com. Please also consider, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or iTunes Podcasts, I suppose, leaving a 5-star review. I'm not even going to ask you to write anything for us. I'm literally just asking you to please click on the 5-star. This is information that people need to hear, and the only way we can get it in more ears is to make it more publicized. One of the best ways that we can do that is by growing this podcast. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. You've been listening to the FDN Thrive podcast. As always, I'm your host, Evan Transu, aka Health Coach Ev. We will talk to you very soon. Thanks for tuning in to the FDN Thrive podcast. If you feel like you've been stuck in the cycle of trial and error when it comes to your health issues, our team can help. Whether you've tried every different diet out there without lasting success, spent way too much money on supplements at your local health food store, or been told that your lab tests are normal despite feeling anything but normal, we have your back. Go to FDNthrive.com and click the Get Started Here button if you're ready to stop playing guessing games with your health. That's FDNthrive.com.